Okay, so welcome to Critical Race Theory. First thing we're going to do is we're going to watch a clip from a YouTube video essayist named Nerdwriter. And he's using the analogy of the Truman Show to talk about what waking up to a new reality, or a reality that is starkly different from the one you thought it was. What is the actual experience of that? What is the psychology of that? So we're going to watch this clip, and he's talking again about the Truman Show as an allegory for politics and for this shift in our awareness of the society we are in. This clip is about 6 minutes, and then I will have kind of a prompting question for us after that.
Christoph, let me ask you, why do you think that Truman has never come close to discovering the true nature of his world until now?
We accept the reality of the world with which we're presented. It's as simple as that.
In the beginning of The Truman Show, a star falls from the sky. Well, a light falls from the ceiling of a sky-high set that encloses an artificial town built for the life of one man and the entertainment of the whole world. The light says Sirius 9 Canis Major, which refers to Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky. This star, which Homer once called an evil portent, bringing heat and fevers to suffering humanity. In the film, the falling of Sirius is the first in a series of ruptures in Truman's fake reality, a series that ends here, with an actual rupture, a breach in things as they are. Like in Homer, Peter Weir, director of The Truman Show, envisions this door into real reality in darker terms than you might expect. All the symbols we usually associate with goodness and positivity are behind Truman. Bright blue skies, sunbeams breaking through the clouds, an expansive sea of possibility. Reality, truth, and authenticity, on the other hand, are relegated to a small, single rectangle of shadow, hardly the light at the end of the tunnel that we normally associate with liberation. All throughout the film, freedom for Truman is linked tightly with trauma. Every peek behind the curtain is accompanied by some form of pain, whether it's the pain of seeing the image of a deceased loved one, the pain of a true connection abruptly cut short, the pain of memory, or simply the pain of uncertainty, of not knowing what it is you're seeing. That's, of course, a pain that we're all familiar with. It's why, for the most part, we see only what we want to see. Truman has been privy to a lifetime full of hints, clues to the fact that his world is not as it seems.
Truman! It's television! Yes!
But to incorporate those clues means to reconfigure the entire narrative of his existence. And rewrites like that just aren't free. They cost. They cost suffering. Peter Weir and writer Andrew Niccol were prophetic about so much from the vantage of 1998. The ubiquity of reality television, the rise of mass surveillance, they keyed in perfectly to my parents' generation of Cold War paranoia, of being watched or bugged, and my own generation of narcissism, where it bugs us not to be watched. That's a great joy of The Truman Show. The allegories and layered readings, the headiness of it all stands out vividly, even for a kid like I was when I saw it at age 10. It's not pedantic or preachy, it just asks so many damn questions that they're impossible to ignore.
What the hell are you talking about?
Who are you talking to?
And actually, I was watching it again recently, and I was really struck by how easily The Truman Show can be read as an allegory for the present. Like Truman's town of Sea Haven, our own world seems to be experiencing a similar series of ruptures. Ruptures like the Great Recession in 2008, the Arab Spring, like the killings of young black men by police or our increasing awareness of them, like Brexit, the splitting of the UK from Europe, and most recently like the rise of the political outsider movements of Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. I think American society at large is a lot like Truman Burbank, laboring like him for 30 plus years under a system that is finally showing itself to be ridiculous. Society, like Truman, is trying to wake itself up while stumbling under the pain that surfaces from doing so. The Truman Show is a massive operation with a crew and cast of thousands, but for all the power that Christoph commands, the show's success always hinges on Truman himself. It can only work if Truman believes in it.
He could leave at any time. He was absolutely determined to discover the truth. There's no way we could prevent him.
The powerful in our world hold things in place like Christoph holds Truman, but we hold ourselves in place, too. If nothing else, it's clear that in 2016, we are slowly waking up into a new political reality. Like in Truman's world, the power relationships of our own have gained and consolidated strength by convincing us that they're normal, like laws of nature. By taking any breach and folding it back into the narrative, they've kept all those like Truman, who are perennial losers, at bay. But ideologies don't last forever. Eventually, they crumble under their own weight and the increasing refusal of people to believe in them.
Thank you for your help.
You're welcome, Truman.
The Truman Show shows us what waking up looks like. It stages in a really valuable way the struggles that come with it. It shows how the messaging of the dominant ideology is absorbed into media and into education. It shows us how individual people, even people we trust, good people, can become the mouthpieces of a rotten system.
Everybody is in on it. I'd have to be in on it too.
And most importantly of all, The Truman Show imagines liberation, not as utopia, but as a world flawed like our own, full of multiplicity and contradiction, and people obsessed with TV. It's a world gained only by struggle and pain, one that often looks like an evil portent in the moment. It's not a sunburst in the clouds or an endless sea, but a small, shadowy door that leads off to a territory unmapped, but invested, hopefully, with a greater authenticity.
In case I don't see you. Good afternoon, good evening, and good night.
All right. So again, that was taking the allegory of the Truman Show and looking at what our shifting perception of reality of the United States, of United States history, is in this moment. So we are in a shift similar to Truman Burbank in terms of how we are understanding the United States specifically, but even how we're understanding our entire world. And those shifts have emotional, psychological, and social implications. So I have a check-in for you all to do with each other and in chat. I'm going to see if we can unmute some folks, but if not, then I'll have you all do this in chat. What was a fissure or a rupture you experienced that began to wake you up to the reality of racism in the US? And what I mean by the reality of racism in the US, racism as baked in to a lot of our institutions and structures. Racism as not just mean individuals, but as a construct that has existed in American society for hundreds of years. When did you begin to wake up to that reality of racism? So I'm going to stop sharing, and then let me see if I don't think I'm able to unmute you all for this kind of format. Is that your understanding, Dr. Ross, as well?
Yes, the webinar format.
Okay, no problem. Okay, then I want you all to actually post your answers in chat. So I will copy and paste this question, but I actually want you all to interact with each other. So what was a fissure or rupture that you experienced? And we do have 185 folks, so everyone does not need to share, but I would love for during a couple of these discussion questions for y'all to post your thoughts and answers in chat. And I'm sure some of you are interested in just reading what folks are posting. So let's just play it by ear and have a mix of reactions, comments, all of that. So next thing I want to talk about with you all is a very important subject, and that is the musical Hamilton. So why am I bringing up Hamilton? Well, when I first saw Hamilton last year, when it was on Disney Plus, I had two reactions to it that are relevant to today's conversation about critical race theory. First reaction to Hamilton, this is a less relevant to our conversation, but my first reaction to Hamilton was, hey, this is a really excellent musical. The costuming is great. The songs are great. The references to other songs, the repeated melodies. So just from a technical standpoint, in terms of a musical, this is a really great piece of media. So that was my first reaction to Hamilton. I also was very pleased about the diversity of the cast. That's one reason that Hamilton gained in notoriety, is that it is still unusual to see a majority cast of color in any Broadway production. And Hamilton, I believe, is like 95% folks of color in the cast. And the amplification of that message in terms of, hey, come see Hamilton because this is a way folks of color often don't get to see ourselves on stage, that was also a part of its popularity. So I was very happy to see that as well. That was my initial reaction to Hamilton. My second reaction was one of disappointment in the narrative of Hamilton. So my disappointment came about due to how Hamilton chose to discuss American history. So Hamilton is a show about Alexander Hamilton and him being one of the founding fathers of America. And he was the principal architect of our financial system and our banking system and things like that, with the reserve and all of that. So the play is about the life and times of Alexander Hamilton. And while there are a number of people of color on stage in Hamilton, they are actually all portraying white historical figures. So Hamilton actually does not have any characters of color at all. So there are people of color on stage, but there are no characters who are canonically in the story people of color. So the man in the green is portraying Thomas. The man in the green is portraying George Washington, excuse me. Man in the navy is portraying Thomas Jefferson. You have Lin-Manuel Miranda playing Hamilton in the darker, or I should say the lighter brown coat in the middle. So while Hamilton, again, has a very diverse cast, the entire play is from the perspective of canonically white characters. Additionally, because maybe that wouldn't have been a big issue, but additionally, Hamilton chooses not to discuss Native American history at all. So in the founding of America, where did all this land come from and how did America get founded? Hamilton does not discuss that at all. There is no reference to indigenous American history in Hamilton. Additionally, there are only a few throwaway lines regarding slavery. So characters are having a little tiff back and forth, and one will say, well, your money comes from slavery or something like that. And that's kind of it. So for this to be a story about America's founding, American Revolution, the beginning of the American government, for this to be a story about that, a story about American principles and freedom and how an immigrant like Hamilton, because he was an immigrant, how an immigrant can succeed in America, for you to be telling that story and to have nothing to say about the contradiction of America's founding in genocide and enslavement, then that's a pretty traditional narrative. That's a pretty traditional retelling of Hamilton. So it really wasn't revolutionary in what it had to say. And I think it will not be preserved in the discussion of great theater history due to that reality. There isn't a lot compelling about what Hamilton had to say. Great songs, and maybe those will continue, but pretty traditional retelling of American history. So Hamilton had me asking the question, what is U.S. American history? How ought we think of U.S. American history? Well, if you put American history in Google, you kind of get an informal poll on how people tend to think of American history. So look at what the images that we see here are. We see, and remember, Google images are indexed by what people click on, so that's why it's an informal poll. We see on the first two lines things that normally come to mind when we think of American history. So we have the American flag. We have the founding fathers, and Alexander Hamilton is actually portrayed in the middle there on the second line, starting with Ben Franklin. We have the Constitution. People think of our founding documents like the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence. American ingenuity with like the space race, things like that. These are the things that we would say are stereotypical in thinking about American history. or what the average person might say are examples of American history. It isn't until we get to the third line down that people of color now start to be referenced. So the third line down, we now have MLK and civil rights. That gets referenced, but only on the third line down. Indigenous history, again, is only getting referenced on the third line down. The history of Black and brown folks in America is often thought of as being ancillary or tertiary to American history. The actual analysis of what our experiences have been, especially the two colonized groups in America. The two groups that have been colonized in America are indigenous peoples and African Americans or Black people in America. And by Black people, I mean specifically Black descendants of slaves in America. Those are the two groups that were actually colonized in America. Other racial groups have different experiences than that. So other people of color and populations of color are not the colonized populations of America. That is descendants of slaves and indigenous folks. Our history, the role that we had in America's conception, in America's building of wealth, in America's building of infrastructure, all of that, that history is often considered ancillary to the founding of America. And what I mean by that is people say things like this, hot takes like this on the internet, or even on talk shows, on different news shows. Discussions about American history in this way are not uncommon. So this person saying that if you're in the US and not white, be thankful that you are enjoying the great civilization built here by white people, rather than bitching for more handouts. I don't see you running back to the crap holes you crawled out of. So this notion that America was built by white people for white people, and that people of color need to be thankful that we are here. This is totally historically inaccurate, right? This is on the face of it ridiculous. Notice it has 5 upvotes, by the way, after only being posted for a couple hours. But this is not an uncommon view of American history, that it's about the successes of European immigrants, that it's a country that always does the right thing, that has a moral foundation that is beyond all criticism. This is a way that a lot of people think about America. And even when people say American, who comes to mind? We've actually done studies on this, sociological studies. When white folks say American, they are picturing other white folks. They are picturing other people like themselves. So who do we even mean when we say American? How often are we thinking of indigenous folks and Black people specifically as American, as fundamentally baked into our country, as people whose blood, sweat, and tears are the foundation of this country? Rarely are we thinking of it like that. So someone in chat talked about what do I mean by colonized? That means that we were treated as resources. Colonized means your land was annexed or captured. You were taken from your homelands and put into enslavement. So the history of colonization in terms of certain lands and peoples being taken over by another group, and then those folks settling on that new land, and how the indigenous folks have been treated, that's what I mean by colonized. So basically, who did not voluntarily migrate to America? Who did not voluntarily migrate to America? Those are two groups. Those are indigenous folks, and to make this slightly more complicated, mestizo folks. So folks who, let's remember that the majority of America was under Spanish control for a long time. So there are folks who are indigenous, who have a mix of, or let me change that. There are folks who are descendants of indigenous peoples and Spanish conquistadors. That racial group is called mestizo, and that racial group is what comes to mind when a lot of folks say Latino or Latinx, or when they say Chicano or Hispanic, etc. All those designations are actually ethnicities. Latinx is an ethnicity, Hispanic is an ethnicity, Chicano is an ethnicity. But the brown racial group that comes to mind for a lot of folks, that racial group is actually called mestizo. Those folks are also native to what is now the US, because they were living in Spanish territory, and Spain colonized a bunch of the North and Central and South America areas as well. So we need to remember Spain also colonized people. But when I say the colonized groups in America, I mean those that did not voluntarily migrate here. We were enslaved and taken here for Black folks, and for Indigenous folks, their land was stolen, and then they experienced genocide. So that's what I mean. Okay. So Hamilton had me asking the question of, is the United States a democracy? And by democracy, I mean, are we a constitutional democratic republic / democracy? We have people who are involved in decision-making, in political decision-making. So some people, when you say democracy, they'll be like, oh, America is actually not a democracy or a republic. So I'm trying to collapse those terms together because you know what I mean. Are we a democracy right now? And if so, when did we become one? So is America a democracy now, or the US a democracy now? And if so, when did we become one? I would love to hear some answers in chat. So what date did we become a democracy in your mind? What date did we become a democracy in your mind? So several folks are saying we're not a democracy, never were a democracy. We were a democracy before there was colonization. That's an interesting take on it. So the existence of democracy within indigenous societies. Anyone have a date? So if anyone thinks we are a democracy, give me a date. Throw out a date for that. When did we become a democracy? So I'll give you all another kind of minute to chat with each other, and then we'll move forward. So if you do believe we're a democracy, put a date in chat. We will be getting to how this is relevant to critical race theory. So you didn't come to a half-hour critical race theory discussion, you came to a 2-hour one. So I'm giving you some background and some context about what the critical race theory really is about. So please enjoy the ride. That's all I can say. So a number of people said 1965. Someone said 1920, when women got the right to vote. Others said 1965. Before 1492, that's before Columbus came, all of that. So yes, let's look at some dates. So someone might have ostensibly said, none of y'all said this, but someone might have ostensibly said, oh, okay, well, when we were colonies, like when we were still a collection of different colonies, people were voting then. So that's when we were a democracy. So the 1600s. And you might have defined us as a democracy then, but at this time period, you had to be a white male Christian property owner in order to have the right to vote. So only about 5% of the entire population had the right to vote. That doesn't quite sound right in terms of a democracy. Democracy is about the majority of folks having the right to vote. So maybe you wouldn't count that as a date. Or you might have said the next time period, 200 years in the future, when the next group got the right to vote. And these are Black men, when they got the right to vote after the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So maybe that was your date, thinking about 1865. This is the period of time where another 2% of the population got the right to vote. And this was after African Americans had put 250 some odd years of work into America. So let's remember that enslaved folks built entire towns, roadways, railways. Enslaved folks rebuilt the White House after the War of 1812. So after all of that investment, and again, investment under the threat of death, like enslavement, but still also investment in America, this is the next period in time where the next group of folks got the right to vote. Think about that. 200 some odd years of only white men having the right to vote in America. Then the next group got the right to vote in the 1860s. Several of you mentioned suffrage, women's suffrage, and when women got the right to vote in the 1920s. This is the first period of time in US history where over 50% of our population now had the right to vote, was 1920. My grandmother was born in 1926. So let's really think of how recent in time that is. How recent in time those we finally had over 50% of our population able to vote. Maybe you knew something about indigenous citizenship history, and you know that Native Americans did not have their right to citizenship guaranteed and federally protected until 1924 with the passage of the Snyder Act. So indigenous folks did not get their right to citizenship secured until 1924. And then after that, individual states were still able to prohibit tribes from voting. So the last state, which is Utah, I believe, ended its prohibition on indigenous tribes voting in 1962. So Native Americans did not have their right to vote guaranteed until 1962. And then several of you mentioned the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which is 1965. This actually helps protect both African Americans and indigenous people in their right to vote. Because before the passage of this, the Voting Rights Act, we had things like poll taxes, trying to economically keep people from voting, literacy tests, unfair literacy standards that were applied totally differently based on what group you were a part of to prevent people from voting. We had things like the grandfather clause that said if your grandfather couldn't vote, you can't vote. Things like that, that actually created tremendous barriers to voting. So is that when we became a democracy, when the Voting Rights Act of 1965 passed? Well, many of you know that most of the parameters of the Voting Rights Act have been invalidated by the Supreme Court. So we don't even have the Voting Rights Act in action now. Additionally, I'm sure you're hearing about current and modern voter suppression tactics. Things like removing voting machines from different counties. Things like intentionally creating long voter lines. Things like kicking people off of voting rolls due to overly broad search features and saying, oh, if this person hasn't voted in the last 2 years, we're kicking them off of the voter rolls. All these different kind of voter suppression tactics. And the additional threats in terms of now voting integrity. So not letting people have mail-in ballots and things like that. So are we really a democracy now when we are still dealing with so many voter suppression efforts? Last question I want to ask. To what are Americans and all people entitled? What are Americans and all people entitled to? Well, America was actually founded in ethical principles. Every country can't even claim that. Other countries are not necessarily founded in some kind of ethical declaration, but America was. Some people might scoff at the word entitlement, saying this is the problem with America. People think that they are entitled to different things. And I think America is about rugged individualism and pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. So some people might scoff at that word entitled. But I would actually argue, Mike, you got it, that we articulated some of the most fundamental entitlements in America. We articulated some fundamental entitlements, and these should sound familiar. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We said not every American, not every citizen, not every resident. We said every person is owed life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That these are inalienable rights endowed on us by our Creator. So is everyone in America right now entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? How are we going to understand America without understanding how Americans do not all have access to these things? That is the conversation about critical race theory. how are we going to talk about America and what America is and whose history matters in America? So again, whose history matters in America? What do we owe each other as Americans? And do we owe each other the necessity of telling the truth, the whole truth about all of our experiences in America? That is the debate on critical race theory. So I'm going to have us watch 3 clips in succession. And then I'm going to do another pause for y'all to communicate in chat, and then we'll take a quick break. So I want to mention something to you that comes from film studies, and it's called the Kruleshov effect. And it says that we don't derive meaning from a single shot in a movie, like just a single camera shot of something. We don't necessarily derive a lot of meaning from that. We actually derive meaning from the contrast between 2 or more different shots. And we get more meaning from those things combined rather than just one shot. So I'm going to take a page from the Kruleshov effect, and I'm going to show you 3 clips in succession. And then I want you to think about, what is the relationship between these clips? What am I trying to say with the collection of these 3 clips? And again, thinking about whose history is going to be told and how is that history going to be told in America? Whose history matters? All right, let's go. Let me make sure I'm sharing sound. Yes. Okay, here is clip number 1.
This mobile phone footage captures the last moments of Ahmaud Arbery's life as he was jogging through a Georgia neighborhood in February. As he approaches a truck, the 25-year-old is confronted by 2 armed men who reportedly believed he was a burglar. As Ahmaud appears to try and avoid them, a shot rings out. Then a struggle ensues between the unarmed man and a white male with a shotgun. More shots ring out as Ahmaud is shot point blank before stumbling to the ground.
I mean, it's hard. I'm not sleeping. And I just think about how they could allow these 2 men to actually kill my son and not be arrested.
The men have been identified as Gregory McMichael, a former police detective, and his son Travis. According to a police report, the men armed themselves and chased Ahmaud Arbery, who they suspected was responsible for a series of break-ins. The elder McMichael alleges Ahmaud Arbery then attacked his son, who acted in self-defense. Neither man has been arrested or charged. Since the video emerged, protesters have taken to the streets where the young man was killed. The lack of charges and handling of the case has enraged civil rights activists across the country.
We decided to do something positive for Ahmaud because this is what he needs right now. He needs justice. He's not here to be the voice, so we are his voice.
Georgia's Governor Brian Kemp has responded by saying he wants a thorough, independent investigation. The state's Attorney General expressed deep concern, but the men's claims that they were acting under a state citizen's arrest law is being questioned. The death of Ahmaud Arbery echoes the case of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin, who was shot and killed here in Florida 8 years ago. He was pursued by self-appointed neighborhood watch captain George Zimmerman, who used this state's Stand Your Ground law as a defense. He was eventually found innocent in a case that still haunts the African-American community. No justice, no peace! The Trayvon Martin shooting was one of many in recent years that sparked a nationwide protest movement. Ahmaud Arbery's case will eventually go before a grand jury, but that may not happen for weeks with current restrictions in place. In a transcript of the emergency call made by one of the 2 men, they were asked if Ahmaud Arbery was committing a crime. "He's a black man running down our road," was the answer. Andy Gallagher, Al Jazeera.
For Emmett Till, southern trees bear a strange fruit. In this photo, he's laughing, and there is no cotton gin tied around his waist. He's not stretched into swollen limbs. His eyes are still hazel and recognizable. 2 neat white rows of perfect teeth sit totem-like in his mouth, and the world did not know him because he had not been murdered yet. He's still slipping into the kitchen to get another piece of cornbread while his mama ain't looking. He's gonna mash it with his fingers, drink some buttermilk, and smile with those eyes, and they are still hazel and bright like stars in uppercase, and ain't nobody gouged them out or shut them closed. And when he goes to school, he'll do a silly little dance with his arms and legs cocked out at odd angles, and his classmates gonna laugh, and there will be no cotton gin tied around his waist. You know, in this photo, he's proud of the hat on his head. You can see that by how straight his neck is, and his mama's in the picture, and they got the same face, and his head is high and perfect, and ain't no bullet in it, and it will be months before there is one, and in those months, he is his mother's child, the smug and overfed man-child all Southern ladies love to cook for, 'cause he licks the plate clean, and ain't no men dressed like midnight with sunless, unlaughing eyes snatching him out the door, changing everything when neither he or his mama asked to be anything other than laughing in the kitchen with the greens still simmering in the pot. This last photo of Emmett Till is a holocaust. The one history concretized into the nighttime musings of black children who hopscotched above and below Bible Belt, who saw a tattered otherworldly version of the 14-year-old Emmett Till, head poised strangely above a sharp black suit on the cover of Jet magazine. There were no eyes smiling. Mischievous man-child, wonderful, cornbread and buttermilk slicking, fast-talking, looking like his mama, bubblegum pop, saunter and sizzle, straight-necked, full of tomorrow's boy, staring back into the camera. What was there was not there at all. What was there swallowed the world. It is an image I shoved at my own 14-year-old son, frenetic in my attempt to tell him that this is black history. I need him to know if he's not careful, not brave, not the sum total of all our unlit courage, if he relegates these stories to cliff notes, well, he bleeds out and dies in the epilogue. So I need you to know, Salih, my arms are never going to be wide enough to cover sins like these. That your head held so high is still a cautionary tale, but go on and do it anyway, son. Go on and do it anyway, and laugh and dance and clap and dance with your arms and legs cocked out at odd angles and slip by me and get the extra cornbread whenever you can, and be grateful that when you and your boys say some slick shit about the pretty blonde girl in the front row of algebra, you're permitted that levity after 400 years of midnights, necks decorated in nooses, plantations that dressed up terrorism in white lace gloves and mint julep. I tell my son to remember Emmett Till when his head was high, when his eyes were still hazel. I tell my son I'm gonna be his mama all the days of my life, that I will celebrate his brown boy buoyancy. And while I do not know what tomorrow holds, I know he'll never be strange fruit. He'll never be broken open. He'll never have his face so like my own, crushed, hatcheted, and mangled. I tell my son, I'm growing these limbs for you, Salih, to get around you and surround you. And we will be strong and unapologetically black for as long as we can be.
That is Dominique Christina, who is a local spoken word poet to Denver, Colorado. So tell me, what do you feel like is the relationship between these clips? Why do you feel like she referenced Black history in those clips? Let's go ahead and do the same thing. I want some folks to share and chat, and then for other folks to read. So I will give you another 3 minutes. Talk about what do you feel like the relationship between these clips are and what the reference to Black history means there. Okay, we're gonna get started again. So what is critical race theory? How do we really understand what this debate around critical race theory is? Well, we need to understand that it's actually a debate about ideologies, about how we're going to think about America and American history. So you have kind of comments like this from GOP leader Kevin McCarthy that says critical race theory goes against everything Martin Luther King Jr. taught us, not to judge others by the color of their skin. So there's this notion that critical race theory is somehow in opposition to the teachings of MLK. a person who talked about America's failure towards Black people, talked about how America had never lived up to the idea of America, talked about the experiences of Black people and impoverished folks and other marginalized folks in America. There's this notion that critical race theory is in opposition to that. Is that accurate? We're going to find out. There's this statement where the use of the term critical race theory is very intentionally being used to talk about a number of issues, right? To talk about a number of quote unquote cultural conversations about our ideologies around things like American history. So Christopher F. Rufo said, "We have successfully frozen their brand, critical race theory, into the public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it toxic as we put all of the cultural insanities under that brand category. The goal is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory. We have decodified the term and will recodify it to annex the entire range of cultural constructions that are unpopular with Americans." I find his use of the word American there interesting. Again, who is he talking about? And is he talking about Black and brown Americans? I don't think so. So this is from the Heritage Action for America, which is, I think, the 501c4 arm for the Heritage Foundation. And here's what they're saying critical race theory is saying. Critical race theory says that there's no absolute truth. There's no such thing as objective truth. There's only competing narratives. We'll see if that's accurate. They say individuals are either an oppressor or a victim. So if we're talking about Black people as an oppressed group of folks in America, well, that's, turning Black people into victims. And, that's not good. And then it's trying to craft all white people as oppressors. Wow. Well, yeah, that's anti-American. And they're like, oh, they're trying to say that America is systemically racist and that America itself must be dismantled. This is all of the stuff that the Texas Policy Foundation listed as how to identify critical race theory in the classroom. So how do you know if your child is being taught critical race theory? They actually listed these as all euphemisms. They have since deleted this tweet once people said, what are you talking about? But again, it reveals how the terminology critical race theory is actually being used. They're saying all of these different things here are actually euphemisms for critical race theory. And remember, going back to this tweet, let's make the brand toxic. Let's recodify an entire range of cultural conversations and constructions under the umbrella of critical race theory. So they're talking about any DEI conversations, diversity, equity, inclusion, that's critical race theory. Cultural or multicultural competence, implicit and unconscious bias, social justice and restorative justice, systemic, structural, and institutional racism, microaggressions, anti-racism, white privilege, cultural IQ, colonialism, power structures, normative, the word normative, desperate outcomes or inequality, identity, ally or allyship, Afrocentric or Eurocentric, social constructs, Black Lives Matter, reparations, liberation, and ethnocentricity. They're trying to frame all of these things as elements of critical race theory in the classroom. This is, I think, a very revealing quote from, again, Heritage Action for America. Rejecting critical race theory is one of the most important fights for conservative grassroots since the Tea Party movement. Interesting. So here are the number of states that have proposed legislative bans on anti-racist teachings and trainings. So many states have banned or do have bans on the books in terms of restricting what can be taught in terms of education, what you can teach about history, how you can talk about the experiences of different groups in America. There are laws on the books right now that are now severely restricting that, especially restricting how you can speak about the histories of people of color in America. Most Americans actually have no opinion on critical race theory, but Republicans have strong opinions on critical race theory. This is actually a part of what the debate is about. It's actually being purposefully used as a cultural wedge, and it's specifically being used as a wedge for Republican and conservative voters. It's about them and how they perceive what a threat to America's ideology is. How we talk and think about America, we're losing. They think of it as winning and losing the folks who are behind the critical race theory conversation, because this emerged from like Tom Cotton, that senator, and some other folks. He's either a senator or representative, I can't remember. But Tom Cotton and some other folks like purposely started this conversation around critical race theory. And who are they talking to? Who are they trying to get the attention of? It's conservatives and Republicans. So most of America doesn't really care about this. But you can see more and more folks are starting to have negative perceptions of critical race theory, and the majority of those folks are Republicans. Yes, and I can provide a copy of this after today's presentation, or the data versions of the slides. That was a question in chat. So what are the core tenets of critical race theory? How do we actually need to think of what critical race theory actually teaches? First thing to know is that critical race theory comes out of critical theory, which is really an analysis of power and how power structures maintain themselves in a society over time. So critical theory, it does have, it was basically, it's a series of structural power analysis. Like different theorists have contributed to critical theory, but it's looking at structural power and analyzing that and how it maintains itself over time. So you will hear some folks talk about how critical theory and critical race theory are Marxists. Those, there are Marxist philosophers who contributed to this theory. The theory is not in and of itself Marxist. It's talking about a number of different power structures. Class is one of them. And yeah, a lot of analysis on class and classism comes from Marx. We also need to stop being scared of that conversation. The way the words communism and Marxism get thrown out in our culture to mean bad and scary is really intellectually dishonest. It's what are the actual ideas that you are critiquing? And just calling something Marxist is not a criticism. There is a real school of thought that came out of Marxism about class analysis, and it influenced other kinds of analysis. So yes, Marxists, or people who studied Marx, did contribute to critical theory, and also subsequently critical race theory. That's okay though. That's not a problem. It's merely one philosophy and one way to analyze classism and capitalism. Now, in terms of critical race theory itself, this is from a book on critical race theory that is not perfect, but it captures some of the major tenets of critical race theory. So I'm actually going to spend a little bit of time explaining each of these. So 5 tenets of critical race theory are the belief that racism is ordinary, and by that this person means normative in the society. It is not a deviation from a norm. It actually is normative in American society. And normative means like it's been standardized, it's a part of what's been baked in, not that it's good or normal in terms of good, but normative in terms of how it's been constructed in our society and how it's the rule, not the exception. So racism is the rule in our society, not the exception. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. It's about the idea of convergence of interest. And what convergence of interest means is a lot of the gains around race that have been made have actually benefited people economically. And by people, I mean those in power who have essentially either allowed or contributed to changes in our society around race and racism. They've only gone along with that because they're making money off of it. So it's the converging of interests where marginalized groups, how our tactics and our strategies and our desires and needs, how they get absorbed by capitalism, and then they become a part of just capitalist interests. And again, I'll talk more about that. The social construction of race, the idea of storytelling and counter storytelling, and the notion that white folks are the true beneficiaries of civil rights legislation in how it's been conceived. So let's start with belief 1, the belief that racism is ordinary and not a deviation from the norm. So if you understand what structural and systemic racism is, this is what it's trying to get at. In critical race theory, it's a different way to think about legal remedies for people of color and what people of color in this country actually are needing to succeed. It was originally thought in legal scholarship, hey, we have certain constitutional rights guaranteed, and people of color just need to be able to sue based off of violations of those constitutional rights. So the remedy to racism in society is being able to sue people for racial discrimination. That's the remedy to racism in society. And critical race theory comes in and says, well, if that was the remedy, why are Black and brown people still in the position that they are decades and decades and decades after suing for racial discrimination became an option for them? Why are these systems of racism so resilient? And it's looking at structural racism. It says, wow, racism is present in and has been intentionally baked into every major institution in America. So let's think about housing. Racism has been baked into housing, where people live, and what kinds of demographics are in certain places. An example of this is redlining and the Federal Housing Administration. So the Federal Housing Administration had a formal policy that said, we do not believe inharmonious racial groups can or should live together. So we're going to draw red lines around Black and brown communities and deny everyone living in those communities mortgage loans and home improvement loans. Everyone living in those communities. That was a formal policy by the Federal Housing Administration. It was in operation from the 1930s all the way until 1968. Happened in every single major metropolitan city in the United States. It denied Black and brown people trillions, listen again, trillions of dollars in economic gains, because it denied them access to housing and housing mortgages and home ownership. And home ownership is the primary way people have wealth in America. It's the primary way any family has wealth. So Black people in America, and if we're looking at land annexation and land stealing, then also Indigenous folks, collectively got denied trillions of dollars or lost trillions of dollars as a result of formal government policy. So that is not, I can sue for discrimination, because it's a policy that existed during a time period where all that economic opportunity has been lost. There is nobody to sue for that in this present day, but it has baked in economic inequality into certain communities and to certain populations. It's baked in inequality. Those folks are inheriting that loss of wealth, and other folks who got wealth are inheriting that wealth. So it says, we have to start looking at racism in this country and in the ways it's been foundational, in the ways that entire policies and programs and political rights, social rights, economic rights, environmental rights have been denied to some groups and been granted to other groups. We can't understand racism without understanding that aspect of it. It's not an individual employer discriminating against an individual person of color. There are entire structures that are foundational in terms of racism. Converging interest. So that's the second one. This is the idea that essentially when certain gains have been made, for instance, integration, the way we went about integration after the end of segregation had many disadvantages to it. So the Black community, which used to have its own stores, its own doctors, its own lawyers, its own communities, again, as a result of segregation. So the segregation leading to it was, the segregation was not positive, but as a result of segregation, the Black community was actually able to create wealth amongst itself as best as it can. Black communities were able to create wealth amongst themselves. And we spent our money that we earned in the communities that we lived in. So Black folks were going to Black businesses and uplifting those businesses. Those businesses were employing Black community members, etc. One of the ways in which the way we did integration was problematic is we lost a lot of that wealth gain and a lot of that power that had been in our communities. We were still marginalized. We still had lost and had been stolen from in terms of trillions of dollars, in terms of these other government programs and things like that. But with integration, Black communities dissipated and we lost even more of our economic and political power. We did have some of that, and that was also the result of organizing in communities from folks like Malcolm X, from MLK, from the Black Panther Party. Those folks helped organize the Black communities that they were housed in, but we lost a lot of that. In addition, a lot of our leadership was assassinated, and that's again a fact. A lot of leadership in Black communities were assassinated during the 60s and 70s, and then we lost a lot of that momentum. That made some people some more money. The fact that Black communities lost some of that economic power, we started spending money and living in other communities where now there were no Black-owned businesses. All businesses around us were white-owned, and our money contributed to that. So convergence of interest says, hey, some of these things happened as a result of it made folks, the owning class, more money to allow Black people into certain communities, to be able to sell them stuff, to dissipate the power of Black-owned companies. That's a part of why we are where we are today. That's a part of why integration happened in the way that it happened, is it made some people more money. So that's the interests of folks of color, and in this case, Black folks, saying we want to get rid of segregation. The way that happened is a converging of interest between the Black community's interests and then capitalist interests that said, okay, we're gonna go along with this, but only in certain ways that it's going to provide advantages for us. Third is the social construction of race. So all categories that we choose to hold as important in our society are social constructs. We are deciding what attributes and traits are important in our society amongst people. So race has been made important in our society. We know that race has no fundamental biological reality to it, beneath like hair texture, nose shape, eye shape, skin tone. That's all that race is. It's those phenotypical surface level physical traits. We know that it has no deeper connection to things like athletic ability or aptitude for the arts or intelligence or strength. We know that race has no relationship to those things. It's merely the surface level phenotypical traits. However, the reason why race became relevant in our society is because race was used as a justification for exploitation. Race was used as a way to justify white supremacy and for things like indigenous genocide, for things like enslavement of Black people, etc. Race was used to justify those things. Ta-Nehisi Coates has a quote that I think is helpful here. Race is the child of racism, not the parent. Again, race is the child of racism, not the parent. Race emerged as a social category because it was needed to justify what was already happening in terms of colonialism and things like that. So race has been made important in our society. We have constructed it as an important attribute that people have in our society. Additionally, we have, in addition to creating different racial categories, we have then ranked those racial categories. So all oppressive systems rely on the sorting and the ranking of different groups of people. We as a society make decisions about how we sort people and how we rank people. So let's take another biological feature folks have. Some people have attached earlobes and some people have unattached earlobes. We don't have any social constructs around that. We could easily have, like, say, thousands of years ago said, oh, people with attached earlobes are more evolved than people with unattached earlobes. And then if we created laws and policies that gave people resources based on their earlobe status, if people with attached earlobes were made to feel superior than people with unattached earlobes in terms of storytelling and things like that, that would have been a social construct or an identity that would have been made relevant in our society, right? So we don't have any social category of attached or unattached earlobes, even though it's just as measurable, it's just as biological as my hair texture or my skin tone. It's still surface level, but it's measurable. You can do an analysis of who has these kinds of earlobes and sort us into different categories. But we haven't made that as a relevant category in our society. There are no laws affecting people with attached earlobes versus unattached earlobes. There are no cultural stories about those kinds of folks. There's no ideologies or stereotypes. So we made race relevant for the purposes of oppression. We, as different societies, made these surface level differences. We created racial categories and then we ranked them in order to justify oppression. That's what is meant by race as a social construct. We're the ones who chose to make skin tone relevant in our society, and we have to be able to analyze that. Last two are somewhat understandable or easy to understand. The idea of storytelling or counter storytelling. So this is again about history. From whose perspective is history being told? Again, you probably learned in school, just like in the chat, hey, women gained the right to vote in 1920, except that's inaccurate. All women did not get the right to vote in 1920. It was white women who got the right to vote. When you learned about American history and you learned about the wealth of America, have you ever really reconciled with how much wealth America gained through the experiences of enslaved folks? How much free and exploited labor that America was actually built off of? Where was that economic analysis in your history classes? From whose perspective is American history often being told? From the perspective of the Puritans and the founding fathers and the perspective of voluntary migrants. That is the story of America for a lot of us, that a lot of us learned. However, there's always a counter position. There's always different identities that we can look at. That is not the story of America from the perspective of indigenous folks. And think about if you had learned about American history just from an indigenous perspective. Hey, we were here for thousands of years and then some invaders came in and we had a lot of different conflicts. Here's our take on our loss of our native land and territory. Imagine if you learned about American history from that narrative. Imagine learning about it from the perspective and narrative of enslaved folks. Hey, I had a home and I had a culture and I was taken from that. And now I've been dumped into this foreign land where I'm trying to figure out what's going on. And now I'm enslaved. And now my children are enslaved. And now my children's children are enslaved. Imagine learning about American history from that perspective. That's what the 1619 Project was about. 1619 Project has been called critical race theory. 1619 Project was banned by Donald Trump, and then that ban got reversed by Joe Biden in terms of limiting certain federal programs from engaging in that kind of training. I actually lost a training contract due to specifically Donald Trump's executive order. I literally had a training canceled because they said, well, according to Trump, this is critical race theory, and so you can't train us. And again, I'm talking about facts. These things happened. These are independently verifiable things. Yet if you're leaving out some of that and only telling a story from a certain perspective, that's what's being debated. And critical race theory acknowledges that. You can tell a story of American history from a certain perspective. And there are perspectives that are being left out. So to really understand race and racism, we have to tell the story from multiple perspectives and from those who were targeted by racism. And then finally, this actually relates to the convergence of interests. Civil rights legislation has not resulted in any material gains for the Black community. If we look at how would we know the Black community is recovering, how do we know the Black community is doing okay in terms of experiences with racism? All of those measurements are quite similar in terms of wealth, in terms of post-traumatic stress disorder, in terms of health outcomes, in terms of educational outcomes. We are still pretty much where we are as the Black community. We are still pretty much where we were by the 1970s. And in some things have gotten worse, like incarceration rates have gotten way worse. And again, that's a story of structural and systemic racism. So who has actually benefited from civil rights legislation? It has not been the Black community. We haven't actually gotten very many benefits or gains out of this legislation. And if any gains are to be named, they're actually gains from white folks, from their ability to exploit our labor in different ways, now through the criminal legal system, and from the loss of Black concentration of capital. Now Black folks can pretty much only engage with white-owned companies, municipalities, things like that. We lost a lot of our political power that we were building up in the 60s and 70s. So it's saying, like, looking at civil rights legislation, it has not resulted in any material gains for the Black community. It's actually really only resulted in gains for white communities. So those are 5 core tenets of critical race theory. Some other elements: that racism is endemic, normal, not apparent or rare. It is deeply ingrained legally and culturally in this country. Again, objectively provable and true. That it crosses epistemological boundaries. And epistemology is like the study of relationships and things like that. Critique of civil rights laws as fundamentally limited. So civil rights laws have not gotten us to an anti-racist society. Critical race theory is about that analysis. And as a reminder, critical race theory is a graduate level theory. This is not a theory that is being taught in K through 12. It is not. It is a graduate level theory. But again, the broader conversation about how we teach American history is actually what is at stake in K through 12, and is what people are referring to with critical race theory. It's a critique of liberalism. So it is a critique of these meta narratives of neutrality, objectivity. Again, if I teach history from one perspective, I can claim that's objective. Hey, the Puritans objectively migrated to America. Hey, like the founding fathers did this. But if I'm only teaching it from one narrative or one perspective, then I can claim that that's objectivity, but it's kind of not. It's leaving out a bunch of other information on purpose. Color blindness, etc. Meritocracy. We've never had a meritocracy in America, ever. Like, there are folks who have always been marginalized and targeted and oppressed, and there's always folks who have gotten political, social, economic, and environmental benefits granted to them. So we can build towards a meritocracy, but we've never actually had that. And it's a call to challenge ahistoricism and recognize the experiential knowledge of people of color. So some tools around this are, again, storytelling and counter storytelling, converging interests, and then critical white studies. We need to study white supremacy and how white people have been granted resources in this country as well. Finally, critical race theory also invokes Antonio Gramsci's concept of cultural hegemony, which is the idea that the dominant ideology of society, the beliefs, explanations, perceptions, values, and morals reflect that of the ruling class. The dominant ideology justifies the social, political, and economic status quo as natural, inevitable, perpetual, and beneficial for everyone, rather than as artificial social constructs that benefit only the ruling class. This is what the real fight is about. Do we view the elevation of white people and the subordination of indigenous folks and Black people as natural, inevitable, perpetual, or even beneficial? Think of that quote way back from the beginning of this presentation. How is it that we are viewing history in the US, and why are certain racial groups lacking in resources? Is that a good thing? Is that, again, natural or inevitable? Is there nothing to see here? Or do we want to analyze how this was constructed, how people have been oppressed intentionally? That's the debate. How are we going to look at American history, and especially those who have been marginalized in America? The fight right now is about how we think of ourselves as a society, the dominant ideologies of our society. So at the end of the day, the debate about critical race theory is a straw man. First of all, critical race theory is not in K through 12 education, but what is in K through 12 education is a different and more complex emerging understanding of American history, and that's what's being resisted. So as you all continue this discussion, I want you to think about what is the real fight here? what is really at stake, and how are we going to think about the experiences of marginalized and oppressed people in America. When some folks are saying, we don't want to think about that, we want to go back to a certain specific way of thinking about American history and the role of white people, men, heterosexual folks at the top of that hierarchy. We want that hierarchy to be natural, inevitable, perpetual, and thought of as beneficial, not that it was a result of oppression. So that's really what's at stake in this conversation. Okay, I'm trying to see if I can have time to stay on. No, I better head out. I have another training for folks. So I will bid you all adieu, but then Dr. Ross will stay on with you, I imagine, for another 30 minutes or so to answer questions and comments. But thank you all so much for your time, and I wish you a good rest of this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Regan.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate you. And everybody in the chat, give your chat applauses if you can. And we see the thank you come in. So we really appreciate you. And I don't want to keep you in because I know you got another place to be. So again, thank you so much for being with the Colorado Community College System today.
You're welcome. And then I will leave my contact information in chat for folks as well.
All right. So folks, that was just a wealth of information, and I'm sure for some of you it was the first time hearing it. For others, you may have heard some of it, and it was a refresher. And then for other folks, it was just really good information to sit on and think on it. And what we're going to do is I'm actually not going to keep us any longer. I want to thank you for your attendance, and we're going to do a follow-up session, just kind of a Q&A and open discussion for those who want to continue this conversation. And we'll be sending out a date. It'll be in a few weeks, so you have time to plan and participate if you feel interested in doing so. So again, thank you guys so much for being here. We hope you enjoyed. Hope you learned a little bit more about critical race theory. It's a really complex but interesting conversation happening, and it's really interesting that it's now happening outside of higher education. And so it's something that I think as educators, we need to be thinking about and being willing to talk about as we think about our role for equity in our system. And we're looking at having courageous conversations and having authentic conversations. This is one of those topics where we can do that. So again, thank you guys so much and have a great Wednesday afternoon. Let's see here. The slides will send out. The chats, I think we are able to copy, and so I will do my best to ensure that you get the chat. I'm not going to promise that, but I believe we have a way to capture that. And Mandy's not with us today, but normally does that, and I'm not so great at the chat Zoom functions, but we'll do what we can for you. So again, where do you access the recordings? The recordings will be sent out to everyone who was registered. And then we also have a SharePoint where they're posted, and we will send that out to you all as well. I think those are all the questions I see. So you guys have a great afternoon, and thanks again for joining.